Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's the first time I've visited Estonia, and I'm finding it a fascinating society, grappling with big issues of integration, and I hope it's only the first of many trips I make. I've been asked to talk about the theme of what is it that makes a home for everyone. And what I want to do is draw on the index that Mariana mentioned to try and get a general sense of the evolution of approaches to multiculturalism across Western democracies, using our index, which measures this process in 21 Western countries. Alas, none of this Eastern European countries are included, which is a major problem. But at the end, I will say a few things about how I think Estonia fits with these models. And at that point, I'm sure to get into trouble. Okay. If one thinks about the evolution of multiculturalism policy debates and policy structures, one starts in the nation-building phase, which was a phase in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, where states were trying to create a common nation to turn themselves into a nation-state, where the nation and the state were coterminous, a period in which minorities were treated suspiciously as possible sources of weakness. And so assimilation was the dominant motif, the dominant way in which states approach minorities. This pattern changed dramatically in the second half of the 20th century as Western democracies increasingly came to accept that ethnic and cultural diversity itself was not necessarily a threat. It could actually be a plus. And over time, Western democracies adopted a view of diversity which was more multicultural, by which I mean a stance in which one accepts, recognizes diversity, legitimates diversity, in which one accommodates diversity, changing one's core institutions in the society to make it easier for minorities to participate in the society, and which supports diversity in the sense of helping minorities find their way in the society. What is striking, what's important for my comments here today is this general shift in attitude, which was related to the growth of a civil rights movement in Western nations, generated very different models about how one should respond to minority populations, and that difference is critical for what I'm about to say. There were essentially two models that are critical here. One is a model for responding to what I'm going to call national minorities, nations within the state, minority nations, people who think of themselves as a distinct people and who seek to have a role in governing themselves, carving out room for a parallel society within the larger state. So I refer here to societies like Quebec in Canada, Catalonia in Spain, Scotland in the UK, and Flanders in Belgium. These are peoples who think of themselves as distinct peoples with a distinct identity who want to govern themselves as much as possible within the context of a larger state. The second model, the alternative model, is a model for immigrant minorities. The key difference with immigrant minorities is that, by and large, they wish to integrate into the mainstream, and the critical question is, what is the policy structure which facilitates that movement into an integrated approach to society? What can you do to change your institutions, to make it easier for people to join without surrendering everything that makes them distinctive? And how can you support that integration process? These are two very different models, and at the end I'm going to try and position Estonia between the two. So let me talk a little bit, how do I get back? Let me talk a little bit first about our index and how we measure these two types of multiculturalism. The first is, as I said, is the multiculturalism for national minorities, and our index has 6 indicators of what we take to be a national minority approach. And I'm not going to go through each of these indicators separately, but the important point is that in these contexts, the state accepts that this is a multi-nation state. There's more than one nation within this country, that one accepts there will be multiple identities, and one accepts the carving out of a space for the minority to govern itself in key areas of cultural and social significance. And one accepts that there will be more than one official language in that kind of society. This is the form of national or of ethnic diversity which nation states confronted earliest. Countries which had these sub-state nations had to come to grips with how to manage, how to respond to them, and even before we started measuring this, most of the countries had come to terms more or less fully. Some countries embraced this model more fully than others, but by 1980, when our measurements start, most of the countries had an approach, and that you can see in the numbers, they're relatively stable thereafter. The only country that moved rapidly in this direction in the period we've been measuring is the UK, which you can see started from dead zero as a centralized state, but moved rapidly to devolution to Scotland and Wales, and embraced this kind of approach to ethnic diversity for sub-state nations. The second model, is multiculturalism for immigrant minorities. And in this case, this is not a case of accommodating a desire for separateness, a desire for a parallel society. Rather, this is a process of trying to find ways of facilitating the integration of minorities into the mainstream. But it's a way of changing the terms of integration. And that's key. It's not simply an assimilative process which says that it's a one-way street and you have to the minority has to do all the adjustment. It's a two-way process in which the majority and majority institutions change in ways which make it easier for minorities to make that transition. And so we have here an index of 8 of signs of what we call this multicultural approach to integration. Everything from affirming that this is a multicultural nation in the constitution and legislation, through changing the curricula in secondary schools, through changing the requirements for public media, particularly television, to make sure it represents minorities, changing dress codes, and, for example, accepting dual citizenship as a way of making it easier for minorities to enter and become part of the society without necessarily surrendering their past completely, and also providing funding support. In the Canadian case, the Canadian government, so I come from Canada, I see the world through Canadian eyes. That will become very obvious to you over the course of my comments. In the Canadian case, we adopted this integrationist approach to multiculturalism, but it was very much still an integrationist project. Multiculturalism for immigrant communities was never about segmentation. It was never about parallelism. It was always about the integration of the minority, the newcomers, into Canadian society. We always assumed that newcomers were simply Canadians in waiting, and that naturalization was the natural process, and we tried to make that as easy as possible. So, here I have some charts to show the spread of this conception of how one should respond or how one does respond to immigrant minorities. In this chart, which is 1980, you can see in the vertical axis, we have the proportion of the population born outside the country. Right, so the vertical axis is just how large is the newcomer community. On the horizontal axis, the bottom axis, we have the score of that country on our 8 indicators. So countries in the bottom left of this chart are countries with low percentages of the population born outside the country, and, not surprisingly, virtually no or limited multiculturalism policies. At the top right of the chart, you have countries with high proportions of the population born outside the country, and strong multiculturalism policies. So let's watch the evolution over time. This is 1980. By 1990, you're beginning to see movement up and to the right. By 2000, that movement continues strongly, and as you can see, You have in the upper right corner countries with very high proportions of the population born outside the country, like Australia and Canada, with strong multiculturalism policies. Australia is the highest here. And at the bottom left, you have countries with very few immigrants and few multiculturalism policies. And interestingly, you have in the middle what I call the battleground states, stealing a term from the US. These are countries with 10 to 12% of the population born outside the country, and in these cases, one finds that, excuse me, in these cases one finds that these are the countries in which the issues are controversial, and countries are making very different choices about whether they're going to have a more assimilative approach to integration or a more multicultural approach. Now, in the 2000s, these issues became much more controversial, but what is interesting is the multiculturalism policies continue to spread, at least multiculturalism policies as we have defined them, and so they are more prominent in Europe in the 21 countries of the contemporary democracies that we look at than they were in the year 2000, despite all the controversies about them. Phase one. An expansion of multiculturalism policies, but still differences across countries. So then, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So let me turn to the 21st century and turn to integration. Here are three politicians who in the early part of this century told us that multiculturalism was dead. They thought it was a wrong turn and that one had to have a much more integrationist approach to minority populations. What is interesting is the term multiculturalism became toxic in some of these countries, but countries did not rip out the existing multicultural policies that they had put in place, with the exception of the Netherlands and to a certain extent Denmark. What essentially happened is that countries layered an integrationist policy package on top of a multicultural policy base. To whatever extent they had gone multicultural, they layered over that integrationist approach on top of that, with programs about language acquisition and programs designed to make sure that minorities understood the culture and values of the society, that sort of mechanisms to support integration into the community more broadly. Excuse me. What this meant is that you got different models of integration. Those countries which had gone down the multicultural road in the late 20th century added on a integration layer, but the combination produced what I'm going to call a multicultural approach to integration, one which is relatively voluntary, which talks about a right to integrate, provides public support for that integration process, but does not bring tough sanctions to bear on minorities. It allows the minorities to move at their own pace. Those countries which had not adopted a multicultural approach to diversity in the late 20th century tended to adopt a stricter or more mandatory approach, a less multicultural approach to the integration project. Countries like Denmark and Netherlands brought sanctions to bear, linking progress on integration to residency, to access to social benefits, to naturalization. And I think here there was clearly a deeper tension with the idea of celebrating diversity, which is at the heart of the multicultural approach. I would say that what is interesting about the Canadian case is that we were running an uncontrolled experiment, because in Canada generally it was clearly a multicultural approach to integration, but in Quebec it was a distinctive approach which was less multicultural, if you will, and that reflected the geopolitical position of Quebec, worried about the survival of the French language community in an overwhelmingly English-speaking world. And that anxiety about the survival of a language community meant that they have been much tougher on attempts to integrate minorities and much more concerned about not just their language acquisition, not just their employment, but also their sense of identity and social trust. They worry much more about those. And interestingly, I'll come back, they don't do very well. In fact, their levels of social trust, because they're pressing the immigrant communities harder, levels of social trust and identity with Quebec as a polity is lower than in the rest of the country. Okay, outcomes. I've got 1 minute to say that we need David's index. He's right, it's a mess. Measuring the outcomes of these different models is we're relying on highly diverse studies, which vary enormously in their structure, their criteria, their sampling. And so we don't have really good measures of the relative success of what I've called the multicultural approach to integration and the more mandatory approach to integration. But my reading of the diverse literature is that, by and large, the multicultural integration strategy has a positive relationship. There is a positive boost which comes from that approach on issues like civic and political integration. There's not much difference across these two on economic integration, but clearly there are benefits. I would read the literature of people like, not just us, people, my colleagues and I, but people like Bloomrad at Berkeley, or Matt Wright at Washington, or in Washington at American University, is saying that there are these differences that matter. They also demonstrate pretty clearly that identity change is slow and this is a multi-generational process. Okay, I've got 1 minute left, or Mariana's going to terminate me, at least symbolically, if not physically. So let me really get in trouble. How does, what can we say about the Estonian model? What can a person who knows virtually nothing about the Estonian model and has been here for 2 days, what can one say about the Estonian model in comparison to these models I've set out, the two models, the national minority and the immigrant multicultural integration strategy? My sense is that the Estonian case is moving in the same direction as most Western nations, Western democracies, but from a very different starting place. If you go back to 1991, one could have said that the Estonian case is actually closer to the national minority model. You had a very large community, minority community, distinctive language community, which already had the full set of institutions and services in its language that the national minority model seeks to create. It didn't have self-governance, but this is a big community. This is a bigger community than French Canada, than Quebec in Canada. And so one possible way of thinking about this is the national minority model. That was not on the table. The geopolitical situation of Estonia made it very clear for the Estonian community that there would be no discussion of territorial devolution of authority and self-governance to the minority community, that there would be no discussion of a bilingual, multiple official languages, as in the Canadian case, where French and English are both official languages, that this would be the immigrant integration model. So what is interesting, to me at least, as an outsider, about the Estonian model is that it has moved from a social situation of parallel societies, is trying to move towards the immigrant integration model and use the tools of the immigrant integration model to manage a transition in a very big community, far bigger than the communities that I am more familiar with are trying to manage through these instruments. And that's going to be an interesting challenge to overcome parallelism, a social parallelism, through a policy set of instruments which are not actually about parallelism. Excuse me. The only other thing I would say about this is that, and here my time is up. Can I have 30 seconds to say my last word? Thank you.
Not the last.
I would have taken it anyway, right? You know that. The only thing I would say in this process is that I liked David's emphasis on what it takes to succeed in a society, which is an emphasis on language and skills and capacity to be employed and to be successful. What I worry is if there's an excessive concern about attitudes about identity and about trust. Because the comparison between the two sides of Canada, the rest of Canada, Canada at the federal level, which is very multicultural in its approach, and Quebec, which because of its geopolitical anxieties tends to be much more aggressive in pushing the immigrant community into integration, is that trust levels and identity levels, identity with Quebec, as I said before, are lower. And so I think, ideally, one wouldn't worry as much about whether people think they're Estonian. I wouldn't poke people and say, how Estonian do you feel today? I would worry much more about their mastery of language and their capacity to function in the labor market and socially. If there's anything that the Canadian experience tells us, is that relaxing, being a little relaxed about identity issues is an advantage. Now, I know that's a very Canadian thing to say. And if the United States was French-speaking, a giant kin state next to Quebec, I might not say the same things.
Thank you very much, Professor Banting.